Second position on world affirming. In the last couple of messages, we looked at the first position, which I could sum up like this: the Christian's freedom in Christ is so complete that all things are lawful for him. So that was antinomianism. Now here's the second position, and I think that this is one that's embraced by many more people in the church today. Antinomianism is somewhat of a dinosaur, although you do find people today like Jessica Hahn that would fit into that case very squarely. The second would be like this. They would argue we can embrace worldliness. This is a different genre of people, you see, as long as we are using it to reach others. We can embrace worldliness as long as we are using it to reach others. Now, I think this is a very thinly veiled excuse for their own carnality, but we're going to be looking at that as we go along here. They're world affirmers. We've already looked at those who are world deniers. These are world affirmers. Why do they affirm the world? Why is this their philosophy? They're not antinomian. They don't think that there's no such thing as wrong or evil or immorality in the world. There are certain boundaries beyond which they wouldn't go. Recall that the first people, the antinomians, do not believe there's anything outside of Christian bounds, because Christianity is all-inclusive. It's going to subdue, they would feel it's probably already subdued at the cross, the whole of the universe, the whole of creation. So there's no boundary between right or wrong, good and evil, what's morally right and what's morally not. The second group of people would definitely not follow that far. Their boundaries would certainly be much broader, that's what makes them world affirming, than the world deniers' boundaries. But their boundaries are not as far as the first group of world affirmers. So remember, we're talking about different groups of people who still fit under the same category of being world affirming. They fit under it for different reasons. They have a different philosophy. Some are more world affirming than others. I've even said earlier that if we use that in a different context than how it's almost always used, a different context than how we're using it now, we could call ourselves world affirmers, as long as we mean by world God's world. We don't mean the devil's world out there, and that's how it's always used. Worldliness always has something to do with certain types of enjoyments or experiences in the world, and we've listed some of these on the board before. And it goes beyond that. It's just a certain mentality, I think, that one has. Well, let me start this morning, before I describe some of the things myself, with reading an article from Ministries Today magazine of February issue 1987. It is entitled, Wise as Serpents and Innocent as Doves, is the title of it here. And then Ministries magazine always has a little caption summary of what the article is going to be about. And here's the summary. And I kind of knew what it was about when I saw that title, Wise as Serpents, Innocent as Doves. One of the pastoral leader's responsibilities is learning to discern and wisely use worldly influences. In the article, I'm just going to read part of it. The writer, who some of you know, he's a Catholic charismatic, starts off, today I had lunch with, let's call him Mr. Smith. That happens to be his true name, so no one would know which Smith. Today I had lunch with Mr. Smith. I feigned shock when I learned about his passion for professional wrestling. You're not talking about TV. You actually go to the arena? I asked incredulously. Oh yes, Smith replied, who's a pastor himself. You have to be there to watch the people, to catch the feel of the crowd. He thinks the drama of the tag teams with all the malarkey, shenanigans, and regalia are modern morality plays. Here is a man, I thought, who is in the world but not of it. See how he pulls in that little scripture there? We would argue to the contrary. Here's a man who's both in the world and of the world. But here's a man who's in the world, but he's not of it. He's there for some type of different reason than why everyone else is there. He goes as though he's watching a morality play. And if someone asks, now hypothetically, could there not be an occasion where such might be true, I would grant there might be an occasion where such might be true. But for someone who regularly attends and who regularly watches professional wrestling, I think you do it for other reasons than what is being portrayed right here. The surprise of surprises is, the bottom line is that you probably like to watch professional wrestling, and that's probably why you're there. And yet you can excuse that, you cloak that over with another excuse here. Here's the man I thought who is in the world but not of it. Smith is somewhat like the Apostle Paul. He's nowhat like the Apostle Paul. But listen to the comparison here. See if you know what's wrong in this. He is somewhat like the Apostle Paul, who attended athletic events and used what he saw to illustrate his teaching. Oh, come on. Give us chapter and verse for that. They know that, like in the end of 1 Corinthians 9, there are a few references, but listen, that's like me using it. I could either have been there in my earlier unconverted days, or you just know about it living in the world. That's no way of proving that I'm going to them right now. That means because I talk about television or sports all the time that I must be doing it all the time or watching it. And the point is I'm not. That's the whole point, that I'm not. But I could draw some illustration from that. That deserved a green pen in my enumeration. And it got one too. Smith is someone like Paul, who attended athletic events and used what he saw to illustrate his teaching. They use that type of mentality to excuse all types of involvements in the world out there. Now, you couldn't, go so far as drinking or committing adultery, but they'll draw a line. They have a boundary. Unlike the antinomians, they have a boundary somewhere. But the boundary's on the other side of athletic events and all types of involvements in your community and social movements and political movements and ecumenical religious movements. The boundary of whether you can participate or not, somewhere on the other side of all of those things. That is within their Christianity, their participation in the world. Therefore, their view of Christianity is much broader. It's much larger than ours. We have a much more narrow concept of what it means to follow God. And of course, you could never use that text in Matthew 7 about narrow as a way, because they'd say, well, you're misinterpreting that. But that is one that we would use, that the way of Christianity is a narrow way. And when you broaden it like these people are doing, so that the boundaries are so far out there, and the boundaries always seem to me for them to be on the other side of anything that's under consideration. It's always on the other side of it, which means that I'm free to participate. We're talking about two different forms of Christianity then. We're talking about two different mentalities in people. Smith's openness to learning from secular sources and his ability to discern what's valuable in them are tools all Christian leaders must develop. Well, measure of that is true, but not the way they're saying it. That his openness to learning from secular sources and his ability to discern what's valuable in them are tools all Christian leaders and Christian people as well must develop. His articles always contain helpful insights into, quote, bringing the gospel to bear on social facts. And then he quotes Jesus in Matthew 10:16. Jesus said, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves, so be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. He placed us in the world, cautioning us to proceed with wisdom, influencing others and watching how they influence us. That's exactly right. Learning how to adapt worldly knowledge to Christian uses is an important matter for pastoral leaders. If we do it well, we can draw on great resources for building up the kingdom. If we fail to do it, we will be impoverished. If we do it poorly and allow hostile secular forces to diminish the gospel, we are poor stewards, and worse, we are unfaithful slaves. He's describing himself. He said, if we fail to do this, we'll be impoverished. And if we do it poorly and allow hostile secular forces to diminish the gospel, allow them to invade the church, we're poor stewards. He said, oh, worse than that. We're miserable, unfaithful slaves. He said this magazine, he happens to be the editorial director of the company that publishes this magazine in Florida, endeavors to assist pastors and Christian leaders in this discernment. One rule of thumb we have learned is that the more technical the subject, the more easily Christians can tailor it to their use. I'll skip over that. Nothing in them requires us to put faith in ideas that contradict the gospel. And that's a good point. They convey good worldly wisdom about human behavior and relationships that can be engaged in the Lord's service. When ideas and norms are involved, see, he said the more technical it is, the more amoral it is. If it's just a technical matter, well, like the example he gives is eating certain types of food. If it's just a certain technical matter that's kind of amoral, it's not going to, generally speaking, it could, but generally not affect you one way or the other, then Christians could learn from that. What secular sources, what nutritionists have to say. Again, I think that you've got to take that with a grain of salt. He said when ideas or norms are involved, and they are involved, a certain philosophy is involved in professional wrestling. When ideas or norms are involved, the business of discerning secular influences becomes much more complex, and he's exactly right. Anti-Christian concepts and attitudes often lay concealed beneath attractive shells, and sometimes they're not even hidden. For instance, what about rock music? Is it unmitigated evil? How do we reach the young people who are hooked on it? Does Christian rock successfully redeem the salvageable elements of rock, or is it deception in itself? See, when you involve yourself with ideas and norms, then as they have correctly recognized, you're entering a very difficult and explosive area. Because rock and roll music is not just sound, it's not just a phonograph, it's not just an 8-track, it's not just a cassette deck. There's a philosophy in that. There's morality or the lack of it in that. There are norms. There's behavior that is produced by that. That is more than just watching a sunrise. There's something else to it that influences human behavior. Whenever it influences human behavior like that, he said, now we're in a very difficult area. Now it takes much more wisdom to discern the proper use of these things. And it's interesting, they're always, as he remarks here, trying to redeem salvageable elements out of all the pagan mess in the world. Why not just leave it alone? Why try to redeem something salvageable out of it? That reminds me of the mentality of an old junkyard addict who's always rummaging around there in everyone else's junk looking for a couple of things that are salvageable. Isn't it just better to stay away from the place? Sure, you might could find one or two things, but is it worth the pollution of it all? That's the argument. Can't you easily go to the store and at least buy a plastic replica of whatever it is that you're after with the steel real thing in a junkyard and not have to be contaminated with all the filth there? That's about the mentality that the Christian world and Christian leaders have. Visiting a junkyard and trying to redeem whatever's salvageable there. That is as ignorant as can be. And look at the type of people that generally do that. It's the poor people, the people who don't know any better, the people who can't have any more in society. The church should be so rich. She is so rich with all truth, with all knowledge about things. Why would you need to try to redeem something out of rock music? We've got our own music anyway. Why do we need to redeem something out of rock music? Why don't you just either create a new type of music or inherit some other type of music that's been passed down from earlier generations? Charismatic movement has done both of those. And some in the charismatic movement are trying to redeem what's salvageable in secular music out there. Music is not just an audiophora issue. Music is a very powerful stimulus, either for the good or for the worse of a person. It influences a person very strongly. And I can prove that or demonstrate that very quickly to anyone. Just try to live a narrow Christian life and visit a store and hear a certain tune and see how long it takes you to get that tune out of your mind. That proves how powerful music and tunes are. It's not just something that, oh, no problem at all, no issue at all. It is an issue. Or have that person, as some people have unwittingly done around us, hear some of our good music, and they don't like that type, and let them try to forget about that. I've caught lost people whistling Christian tunes because they've heard me singing those songs before. I've caught them whistling it. They didn't mean to, though. They didn't agree with any of what I was saying. But they'd be whistling or humming along one of those tunes. So it works both ways. Our music can influence them, and their music can influence us. But the argument is that it's okay to embrace worldliness as long as we are using it to reach others. And if people are being influenced by worldly ideas and notions out there, we somehow have to be able to identify, this is their argument, with that, or we can't reach them. If the young people in this culture are caught up with heavy metal music, then somehow we've got to present the Christian gospel through the same avenue, or we'll never reach those people. Music is just one of many examples here. Since this is where the world is located, then the church has to be where the world is. Martin Luther used a phrase along this line oftentimes, and I think that Luther's phrase has been misinterpreted, very grossly so, that the church ought to be where the world is. But I think also that perhaps Martin Luther didn't have all of the truth himself. But he argued that the church should be secular, but secular in another way than I think what a lot of people think of when they think of the term secular today. That the church should be, he even used this term, which is essentially what secular means, that the church should be profane. Luther's famous call was, let the church leave the church and become profane. That is, so you can touch and reach people out there. Well, there's a sense in which that's true. In other words, we can't just all live right here in this building together and never leave here. We'll never reach anyone for the gospel's sake then. But when we go out there where they are, there's certain boundary lines that have to be drawn, or we are failing in our mission to evangelize the world. So there's an article to kind of introduce you to what I'm talking about this morning and showing you how some of these people think. And I'm sure you have met them before. I would say this would have to be the number one problem I ever faced in my early Christian walk with relatives such as my two sisters, with other people around me who were, quote, good Christians, unquote, who went to church, but who also attended all the athletic events and all of the musical concerts and just were involved in all of the, quote, worldly things. And to try to prove to them, to try to get them to comprehend or be receptive of the notion that that was not Christian, that it was sin to be doing that, was just beyond my capability, and probably beyond yours as you see in your past life. To try to convince someone that's worldly is next to impossible to do. I don't think that those people, and generally it's a lot of the younger people, have the ability to do any serious thinking about the matter. And even if they do, they don't have a good enough theology so their thinking will take them somewhere, or so their thinking is based on something. See, I don't have to know just what's wrong with what's going on out there, but why it would be better for me to be involved in something else. Or where, to say it another way, the wrong in the world out there is going to influence my theology, and it will influence it. We don't just live and walk through the world and we're not touched or influenced by the people and the notions and the ideas, the philosophy of this world. The more we're out there and the more we brush up against that, the more those thoughts are coming into our mind. And then it's inevitable that you have to do it to work or to shop or whatever, and then to invite it on yourself with extracurricular worldly activities, when it's not something that you have to do. You have to work and shop. You don't have to go to athletic events. You don't have to go and listen to secular music. To invite extracurricular worldly involvement is just inviting problems on yourself then. You already have enough to struggle with living in the world. Jesus said you're in but not of. You've got enough problems living in the world, and you'll double that when you invite problems on yourself with extracurricular worldly involvement. Then truly a person becomes of the world and not just in the world. So this is where the position most people, I think, in the church today fit. But they're somewhat less than honest, I think, in their evaluation of what they do and why. You'll often hear them using this type of argument. Well, it never says anywhere in the Bible that I can't do such and such. It never says anywhere in the Bible that I can't do. By the way, let me start with something even earlier. Notice that you'll rarely hear a positive argument out of them. The Bible tells me that I am allowed to do this. Rarely do you ever hear that. And this business of trying to use the athletic metaphors in Pauline writing is just absurd, as any scholar, any biblical commentator would admit. There's no way under the sun that those athletic metaphors prove that Paul at that time was involved in attending athletic sporting events. That is absurd. So let's start with the positive thing before I give you the negative. I mean, doctrine has to be built on more than an argument from silence. Where does it say in Scripture that you are allowed to do X, Y, Z, whatever it is we're talking about? Where does it say you're allowed to do that? Let's start with that. I mean, it says that we are allowed to meet here on Sunday morning, that we're allowed to teach the Word, that we're allowed to worship, that we're allowed to baptize, that we're allowed to have a family. We're told things we're allowed to do. Now tell me where it says we're allowed to participate in some of these, quote, worldly events, unquote. Well, of course, they would say, well, it doesn't say anywhere because the Bible was written in a pre-advanced culture from what we have today. So it couldn't address matters like that. And so then their next argument would be something like this. Well, nowhere in the Bible does it forbid it. You ask them, all right, tell me where. Show me a verse in the Bible that says that you can attend that Rocky 17 or whatever they're on now that you want to go see. Well, they'll say, it doesn't ever say that I can, but you tell me where it says that I can't. And they think that's real neat. They turn the argument back on you. You're asking them for a positive scriptural justification for it. And they're saying, I don't have that, and then let's see if you can come up with a negative statement about it. It's okay if I go to blah, 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 whatever it is, because the Bible never says it's wrong. It's okay if I go to a Barry Manilow concert, because, after all, that little sweet Jewish boy that played the piano all those years for Barbra Streisand until he made his own first hit with Mandy. What's wrong with that? I mean, that's not it's not rock and roll music, it's good pop mellow music, and he's Jewish besides. And so where does it say in the Bible that I cannot go? I had a sister who that was her thing to do, was to go to a Barry Manilow concert. And my whole argument is that's unspiritual and it's unchristian to do that. Why is their argument? You try to go through the whole business of the philosophy of that, of the narrow way of Christianity. If they're going to use arguments from silence, and I said, all right, let's use some ourselves. Where in the book of Acts were people, were the early Christians, the early New Testament church, where were they ever involved in things like that? Of course, they're so ignorant about history, they would say, well, they didn't have Barry Manilow concerts back then. They had stage plays and productions and sporting events. They had everything then. The Christians chose to abstain. These people today are too ignorant of history to know that. They think that all people did was drag their women by the hair of their head into their cave or club wild saber-toothed tigers. That was back a little earlier in history than that. No, they were advanced. We're not talking about South America. We're talking about the Greco-Roman world. They were advanced. We got our Barry Manilows from them. I mean, we got all of our events and the way that we participate in extracurricular worldly activity. We got it from the Greco-Roman world. They were the first people to civilize everything enough so that you kept the wild beast out of the house and kept the invaders out of the empire so you could settle down and eat, drink, and be merry for a couple of years. Ancient man was always involved in this food, in this hunting and gathering, sociological, anthropological mentality that you don't have freezers to store up food. You don't have grocery stores to go buy food. What you eat that night was gathered that morning, and what you eat the next night is gathered the next morning. You're busy all the time. And during the middle of the day, you're fighting off all your enemies. You don't have time to go to the theater. What did Rome do, though? Greece spreads its culture everywhere, which is a refined culture. Rome spreads its what? Its military might everywhere. And for 1,000 years, we have Pax Romana, a period of great peace now. You have time like we have here in this country. In earlier days, well, you would do it maybe on Saturday night, as we read in John Steinbeck, Grapes of Wrath. You're busy the rest of the time, and now you're busy only on Saturday night working, and the rest of the week is free. That's what technology does. That's what they say it's supposed to do. But the sociologists have done studies that we're busier now than we've ever been in history before. People relaxed more in olden days, that's literally true, than people relax today. Science has a way of creating a monster that it never foresaw and that it can't conquer. That's the business with technology and industry. Well, of course, we would beg to differ with this argument, and we think the Scriptures emphatically state otherwise when they say, it's okay if I go to a Barry Manilow concert, because nowhere in the Bible does it say I can't. We would beg to differ emphatically with that. We think the Scriptures state otherwise, and just where that is they state otherwise, we will be seeing later. But we have seen already in several of our initial key verses, Romans 12:2, be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Now, a Barry Manilow concert may be, in some people's estimation, harmless in comparison to Motley Crue or Led Zeppelin. But in fact, it's not. Just because one type of music produces more explicit sex or explicit violence doesn't mean that its theology is any worse than some of this pop music. Some of the pop music has some of the worst humanistic theology that you could ask for. It might not have the driving heavy metal beat of popular music today. But why is it we think that is the one thing that condemns that form of music? The Christian, who is a thinking person, goes much further than that. And I can never convince them of that. That Barry Manilow's sweet and sweetly sung songs can be just as dangerous as the rock and roll songs of some of these wild psychedelic groups out there. See, if we've got a better view of who God is and of what humanity is all about. All they can think of is somehow it's related to sex and violence, and so that's what makes that wrong. And by the way, you have a whole lot of this sweet, simple music, like that song by Roberta Flack here several years ago, that's so sexually explicit and oriented, even though it's pop music, not rock and roll, that it's absurd to think a Christian could be involved in that. There is an influence that comes through that is so humanistic, it is just as deadly, but it's deadly in a different way than what you'll find in rock and roll music. Rock and roll just seems to deaden your senses to everything. And what this pop music does is convince you that institutional religion is okay. Because it gives you kind of the status quo of American life there, of sweet times, of lovers embracing and all of this, and just mellow bit. And you don't have the challenge that you have in the New Testament message. But we'll see the wheres and why-fors and what-abouts and what-ifs about all of these things later as we start addressing them one by one. But John said, don't love the things that are in the world, because it's lust and it's pride. And there aren't any such things as superstars who don't have pride. And it just has to come through all the time. They may learn that if you act meek on the stage, you can get a better audience, but they've learned that. They've learned to portray a certain image. But it doesn't mean that's true of them otherwise. And you know, these are the very people who don't like rules. These ones who want to embrace worldliness as a way of reaching others, they don't like rules of behavior. And yet, what are they doing? They just have asked us, where in the Bible does it say I can't? You're admitting you're searching for rules yourself. These are the very people who don't like us to say that you can or can't, and right away they're admitting the legitimacy of searching for rules. They just say that you can't find them. Well, anyway, back to how they argue. I don't think they argue outrightly. There's no way you can argue outrightly, because positively the Scriptures don't allow you to participate in any of these things. And if you want to say, well, it is an argument from silence because the Scriptures don't address specifically issues such as the things we've talked about, you're probably right on the second count as well. But I use the word explicitly there. What else do the Scriptures have to say? Is there not a philosophy in Scripture? Is there not a philosophical framework to Christianity that precludes involvement or excludes involvement in certain worldly endeavors? We think that such is to be found in Scripture. But let me take off here and give you a couple of, probably two, of the first thoughts that come to these people's minds. I don't know how far removed you are from these people or how many times you've come into contact with these arguments, but as I say, it probably dominated the early years after I was converted. Going to a Southern Baptist high school where they thought nothing at all wrong with having band, with having football, with having all the sports, with having homecoming. They thought nothing at all in the world wrong with that. With petitioning the senators in the state, with having boycotts, they never thought anything wrong in the world with that. And it was something that I was just at a loss to convince anyone about. Not because I didn't know, not because I didn't have some way to explain it, but at a loss to convince them of it. They're unwilling to believe. As I say, they come up with these arguments favoring worldliness, but I think that generally it is nothing but a very thinly veiled excuse for their own carnality. They will say this in the first place: I have to know about the world if I want to help people in it. Well, that's as old as the Garden of Eden itself, what I call the unhealthy thirst for what is oftentimes unnecessary knowledge. I have to know about the world in order to help people in it. Well, what do we mean by know? Is it an investigative know, K-N-O-W, or is it an experiential know, K-N-O-W? We have argued before that in no way does a person have to have been involved in the world before they can help others in the same situation. That oftentimes is used as the argument or the excuse, that you have to be involved in the world. You have to be involved in that area. You have to know about the world experientially, by experience, in order to help people in it, in order to be able to identify with people in it. Well, you see, if you take this argument to its logical conclusion, then we would say, and theologians have recognized this, and that's why theologians would not stand for an argument like this, if they're thinking, if they'll let their theology come through. Because if you carry it to its conclusion, what we're saying is that this must also be true for God. In order for Him to really help us, then God would have to participate in all the things in the world that we participate in. And they think they've got us whenever we say that by saying, well, see, that's what the incarnation was all about. God couldn't help us until He identified with us. Well, of course, they're showing very thin theology and spirituality when they argue that way. Because we've got to go beyond temptation. We've got to go into sin if we're going to follow their argument. How can someone who has been tempted as in all points as us but not sin, how can he really identify with the sinner? Temptation and sin are two different things entirely. He identified with temptation. He didn't identify with sin, though, except vicariously, and that was by substitution on the cross, and that wouldn't even come into play here anyway. You see, their argument's going to break down here because we're going to have to carry this all the way back to God Himself. In order for God to help the people in the world, he has to know by experience the problems of the world. The alcoholic kind of likes his alcoholism because he said in this way, the Christian alcoholic, if you'll let me use that phrase, because now I can reach out to and identify with other lost alcoholics or with lost alcoholics out there in the world. Because I once was a lost alcoholic. Now I'm saved, but now I can identify because of my current alcoholism. There's so many ins and outs of this argument that I'm not going to take all the time in the world today to follow. But as I say, we would have to take this back to God himself. In order for him to know about the world, in order for him to help the people in the world, he would have to have experienced the evil in the world. Now, if you turn this around and read it a little differently, I have to know, parenthesis, theoretically or investigatively about the world to help people in it. You've got some measure of truth to that, although that's not all there is to it either. It's one thing to investigate, it's another thing to experiment. And listen, people will give us these stats. They will tell us, oh, you're arguing against that, and you're so narrow there, and you just don't know how this brother or this sister who was all caught up in these sins in the past, or maybe they're still involved in them now, how they really helped me and reached me in my life. But we would want to look at that person. That's their own argument. You see, they're arguing from themselves about themselves. We would look at them and see the great paucity of any spirituality in their life. We'd say, well, your argument's not valid because it didn't work for you. Because look at the type of Christian you are. Hear what I'm saying. It's one thing for those people to argue. It's another thing for you to accept their argument because they think that it improved them, but that's an evaluation of themselves. That's self-evaluation there. If I saw in other words, if I saw someone, who was a Christian alcoholic or Christian movie star, and he really helped someone else, the only way that he would help in my definition is he calls another person, let's say in the Hollywood business, who became a Christian, to get out of it completely. That's the only way you could help them. And you see, that will never be the byproduct, never the result of this so-called help. He helped me because he's in it and he can identify with me. Someone like, Pat Boone, he thinks that he's God saves Christian celebrity to minister to people on the Hollywood scene. But what are you going to minister to them about? How can you change them except turn them from a lost celebrity into a Christian celebrity, but still a Hollywood runaround person? You're still there. See, that's only Pat Boone's argument. He thinks that he's helping people because he can make them saved. But see, they have a very reductionist view of what salvation is all about. Salvation is more than getting that man or that woman in some soap opera to say, I believe in Jesus. Amen. Christianity is something that does influence your whole life. Amen. And if it has an influence, and it hasn't the people that are still in it, what do you have to offer to someone else? Nothing but your emasculated form of religion, which you call Christianity. See, the Christian is supposedly on a rescue mission in the world. It's fine to be involved in the world if you're rescuing people. And that's what people like this want to argue all the time. Well, he goes to professional wrestling because he can learn about it and he can minister to professional wrestlers and to people involved there. Well, if you're supposed to be on a rescue mission, you can't pull someone out of a hole when you fall into it yourself. It's like a news account I read here a few months ago, the end of last spring, I believe, where a Washington, D.C. policeman jumped in a swollen river to save a suicidal woman. If you remember the account, you know what happened. They both drowned. The woman was suicidal. She was trying to kill herself. It's a swollen, raging river. The policeman should have let her alone. It was known that she was jumping in to commit suicide. You see, here's the analogy. When you jump into that swollen river to save that dying person, the odds are you're both going to die. You're not going to save anybody. In the turbulence and the swirling around of the world's river, you're not going to save anyone. Their whole argument is, I'm on a rescue mission. You people up there on the hill just study for your own personal benefit, and you don't ever try to reach anyone else. All right, so what's your theory, we ask? My theory is we're on a rescue mission. Fine, that's good. That's a good Christian theory. You should be on a rescue mission. But you can't rescue people who are in a hole when you fall into the hole yourself. What you see, when you're trying to reach someone, if we want to get a little more technical about it, 4 things are involved when you're trying to reach someone. You, number 2, them, number 3, what you have, number 4, and what they don't. Right? Those are the 4 components. If you're on a rescue mission, that's what it's all about. There are 4 things involved. You, them, what you have, and what they don't. Now, for these people, we have the you and the them. This is the person who is the rescuer, and this is the one to be rescued. All right? And we know what they don't have. Down here is the answer. Number 4. They don't have Christianity. And you say that you're trying to rescue them. The crucial point in this business of this theory of the rescue mission is this 3rd point. What do you have? If you are so involved in the life and in the world of people who don't have, how do you expect us to believe that you do? These are the true steps in a rescue mission. It involves you and them and what you have and what they don't. But it has to be what you have. We know what they don't have. They don't have the fruit of the Spirit. They don't have the mind of Christ. They don't have holiness in their life. Well, if you're trying to rescue them, do you have those things? If you don't, you'll fall into the same pit they're in. There's no way you can reach them then. In other words, I don't see how there's any way in the world a Christian professional wrestler can be there trying to rescue unsaved professional wrestlers, to use the example in this article here. What do you have to offer? Well, they would say, well, I've got my professional wrestling, but I've also got my Christianity. And so they say professional wrestling, that's neither ups nor downs, white or black as far as God is concerned. These people are lost and they need to be saved. But there's more than just that to it, though. Because the whole context and the whole environment of your salvation is this. What do you have? You're a professional wrestler. And that's going to profoundly influence the way you think, the way you argue, and how you do or how you don't do theology. So yes, we believe that Christianity should be applied. They think that we have a sterile museum approach to the whole matter. We believe Christianity ought to be applied, but we first and foremost believe, with A.S. Downs in the 1922 edition of the Princeton Theological Review, not only must Christianity be applied, but there must be a Christianity to apply. That's where these people, we think, are falling short. They're real big on this business. Christianity must be applied. That is, you've got to go out there and win people to the message. If you think the message is so right, you've got to get involved. Let there become Christian Hollywood producers and Christian playwrights and Christian screen producers and Christian senators and Christian congressmen and Christian beauticians and Christian, everything. Permeate the world with it. We're on a rescue mission. We believe you ought to apply Christianity. We do too. But there's something we believe before that. It has to come before it. We believe you have to have a Christianity to apply. It's neat to run around with this theory of application. I believe you ought to apply. That is nothing but empty air. That is vanity if you don't have anything to apply. You've run off in all directions. You don't have anything with you. It's the same type of argument we would use with those people who say, now, you people are there not doing anything. The Bible says go, go, go. No, go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. But what did he say to do whenever you went there? Preach the gospel. A lot of people are going. They don't have anything to say, though. Amen. It's fine to go. It's really not fine to go in the way they're going, but it's fine to go. We should go. But we've got to have something to go with, though.
Amen.
These people are saying there's nothing wrong with being involved in these worldly things because, I've got to know about it in order to help the people there. But being involved in it shows that though you may be learning a lot about the world, you don't know anything about what it is you're supposed to be rescuing people into. Because your Christianity is not a Christianity that will square with the evidence in places like the book of Acts. It will not square with that. You're too involved in the world. So a theory of rescuing and a theory of going is fine as long as we have our theory, and the first theory that would come before that, we've got to have something to go and tell people about. Yes, Christianity should be applied. No, we don't have a museum or sterile approach to it. You just get so tired of people saying that they don't understand. They're so confused and so deceived about things, and they're so carnal. They want to be involved in the world out there. They don't understand that that is just as absurd as anything of going, rescuing. If you don't even know what the Scriptures teach, what do you have to share with people then? One thing I'll tell you won't be sharing with them is a separated life in the narrow walk of Christianity, because you're violating it right in what you're doing and witnessing to them. Because you stayed in your old lost worldly way of life. Another article I'll share with you this morning entitled, Reaching Baby Boomers in Southern California. Martin Luther, he's not, but Jack Sims is trying to foment his own type of reformation. A marketing consultant and self-proclaimed baby boom expert, Sims is founder of a non-traditional Southern California church called Matthew's Party. Now you'll get that in just a moment. It's a verse that we mentioned before. His congregation meets in a restaurant. They disdain the stained glass window and typical formal churchiness. Advertises itself on a top 40 radio station and makes a point of catering to the lifestyles of young Americans.